Okay, today we're in Chelsea Physic Garden. I'm here with Louisa Hooper. Welcome to the podcast, Louisa.
Thank you.
It's lovely to catch up with you because we haven't seen each other for well over a year, maybe a year and a half.
Yeah, no, it's really lovely to see you and lovely to be in Chelsea Physic Garden as well.
This is the Travelling Through podcast. I'm your host, Emma, and today's guest is Louisa Hooper. Louisa works for the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. She is a great reader, loves to travel, and her interest in the environment is reflected in her thoughts of London, the world, and life.
It's a little bit windy today, isn't it?
Yeah, overcast, a bit windy, but spring is definitely on its way.
Yeah.
There's beautiful yellow forsythia out there, and the spring bulbs. Daffodils are out?
Yeah.
Is this a favourite place of yours?
Yeah, I'm very lucky to be a member, so particularly over the last year I've been coming much more frequently. It's not far from where I live, so really, I love gardens, so I know it feels like a real privilege to be able to come.
Yes, and we know we're in London because we can hear the planes going overhead as we go. So we wander this way and there's
Are you all right that side?
Yeah. Oh, maybe I should go the other side. Here we go. That's better. Yeah. Yes. So are you a Londoner, Louisa? I never asked you that.
Yeah, so I'm a Londoner, born and bred.
So where were you born?
So I was born at the Whittington Hospital in Highgate, in North London. And for most of my childhood, we lived in a suburb, a North London suburb, Whetstone, which is sort of almost the end of the Northern Line.
Okay.
Totteridge and Whetstone. And
I don't think I've ever been there, actually.
No, it's right sort of on the edge in Barnet. Yeah, interesting. I feel did feel very identified with being a North Londoner.
Yes.
And moved sort of south of the river about 15 years ago to live in Kennington. But I've recently discovered, been doing some family history, that actually whole generations of Hoopers lived in Lambeth.
Oh, really?
So just, streets away from where I'm living now, which is really strange. Yeah, no, it's been really interesting
to go in.
Actually find that, I've sort of got roots that go back certainly to the late 18th century.
Yes.
In London, or sort of in Surrey as it was then.
Yes.
And also discovered a Norfolk connection, which I didn't know anything about, but when I mentioned it to my father, who's in his 80s now, he said, "Oh yes, the Norfolk connection."
Oh, really?
And apparently my grandfather used to go for summer holidays in Norfolk somewhere, and this has sort of passed through the family history. So it's been really interesting.
It is nice, isn't it, when you research your history and you realise how intricate the family can be when you go back, and maybe it helps you to understand why you are the way you are. I don't know whether the genes help that.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really interesting to think about that, and why. So the person who came from Norfolk was a woman. And she would have been in her 20s. Why did she come to London? And how, kind of imagining what the story is there. And then, so that's my father's side. My mother's family are all Jewish, so they were all early 20th century.
Yes.
Immigrants from Russia. So I haven't got sort of much beyond that when they arrived in the UK, which was sort of 1904 or something.
Where did they come from?
So one side came from, they talk about Russia, but I think Russia was a vast thing at the time. So I think one side came from the Ukraine.
Okay.
And the other from Latvia or Lithuania, somewhere sort of around.
Oh, wow.
But
so that's going to be, you have to go there.
Yes.
Was that one of the reasons you went across, did you go across Russia for your trip, didn't you?
Yeah, so we took the Trans-Siberian from Moscow to Vladivostok at the end of 2019, and I guess there's some sense of just being curious about what that part of the world was like, but haven't actually been to those specific areas.
Have you been to the Ukraine? No.
No. Have you
I've been just to the very western edge of it, to Lviv, if that's how you pronounce it. An amazing city.
Is it?
Yes. Big buildings, stone buildings, architecture is beautiful. It's a beautiful place to visit. I think the rest of Ukraine, I mean, it's an incredible place, I think, but it's on my list to explore one day. So, and your travels took you across Russia on the Trans-Siberian.
Yeah.
And how did you find that?
It was amazing. It was just, so it takes about, if you didn't stop off anywhere, it takes 7 days.
Yes.
But we stopped in 3 or 4 places along the way, and it's a bit like the Trans-Siberian isn't one train, it's just a network of rails, so you can kind of get on and off and plan your trip, although you have to do it in advance.
Yes.
And I mean, it's a cliche, but they're just the scale of the place, and you keep changing on the train, you keep changing time zones, and each carriage there's a little list up of all the places it's going to stop, and there's a red line every time you're going to change a time zone.
Oh my goodness! So it's a lot more sophisticated, because I did this in 2002, I think it was, and there wasn't anything like that.
Really?
We had no idea where we were or where we were going, but. Did you go from Moscow to Vladivostok?
Yeah.
So we were coming the other direction from Ulaanbaatar, from Mongolia.
That must have been fascinating. Yeah.
So how many days did it take you then with your stop-offs?
2 weeks it took.
Oh wow!
And we stopped in Irkutsk.
Oh, so did I.
Yeah,
did you go to Lake Baikal?
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. And it was cold because it was November. It was very cold, and the lake was just beginning to freeze over, and amazing icicles at the edges, and extraordinary place.
Because there are boats that go across, don't they? But in the winter, obviously, they can't.
That's right.
It's incredible. It just totally freezes over. So I think it rained the whole time I was there. It was only for a few days, but
right. No, it was snowing, and Irkutsk was fantastic. We spent 3 days there, I think.
Oh, did you?
And that's really fascinating. And that's got a Jewish there was a whole sort of Jewish population there, and there's a synagogue there from the 19th century, which then became something else, during the Soviet era. And I think they were called the Novemberists or Decemberists.
Oh, Decemberists,
yes. Who tried to create a revolution in the early 19th century, and then all got exiled to the area around Irkutsk, and their wives petitioned the Tsar to go as well, and he allowed them, and they sort of set up this, it's kind of the Paris of Siberia, with all these sort of wives while their husbands were doing hard labour and nearby, and they it's a fascinating story. But
I didn't realise that, because when I went, it was Irkutsk was just really a landing point, and then we just had 2 days in Lake Baikal, and then we got back on the train. So at that time we were put into a car when we arrived in Irkutsk, and they locked the door so we couldn't get out.
Oh, right.
It was very strange. And but we survived. We got to Lake Baikal and stayed with a local family.
Oh wow.
And then then got back on the train. But so I missed out on all that learning about the history of that. So clearly I've got to go back again.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting city. And then we stopped at Khabarovsk, or Khabarovsk, however you pronounce it.
Yes.
Which also, just for like one night, and then ended up in Vladivostok. And then originally we were thinking we would get the boat to Japan, but because it was winter, it would have just sort of taken too long and been too cold, I think. So we flew to Tokyo, and immediately went north to Fukushima, which is the area where I lived for 2 years when I first left university.
Okay.
Of course, everyone's heard of Fukushima now, because of what happened. But the place where I stayed was in the west, so it's sort of very inland, so quite a long way from the the coast and the nuclear reactor and everything, and
Yes.
very rural area called Aizu. And
Aizu.
yeah.
Okay.
So we took the bullet train north and the Shinkansen, and then the person who was my homestay when I was, kind of 20, when I've kept in touch with, and so she's now in her 70s. So she picked us up.
Oh, how lovely.
And we went and stayed with her and her husband. Her husband's now the mayor of the town.
Shall we sit?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, and she's a tea ceremony master.
That's fantastic.
So we stayed a few days with them, which was lovely, and we saw kind of various people that I'd known, and they're just amazingly welcoming.
Yes.
But it's interesting, they don't generally have central heating in Japanese houses. So the room that we were sleeping in wasn't heated. We'd gone through the whole of Siberia and been fine, and we were just so cold.
Were you really? So the trains obviously are very well heated inside as you go across.
Yeah.
Obviously you have to be with it across the Trans-Siberian train. And did they have those big, what they called samakoi, the big tea urn?
Yeah,
Is it
samovars.
Samovars, that's right, yes. The big tea urns at the end of each carriage. And then going on the bullet train, which is a different kind of modern.
Yeah.
Was there a big difference between travelling on those two networks, or did you find both?
Yeah, so Japan's interesting because it's got the sort of the bullet train, and it's incredibly efficient and fast and well organised, but there are also these tiny little rural trains that go kind of in the middle of nowhere and sort of chug along, so it's got a whole sort of spectrum. I think the Trans-Siberian is sort of very official and managed, isn't it?
Yes.
And you get your carriage, and you're not really supposed to go into anyone else's carriages. And
also when you get off at the stations, they say don't cross the tracks, because another big if another train comes in, that's it. You won't get onto your train, so you could easily miss it.
Yeah. It was. We tried actually, because we then went on to other places wherever we could. We tried to go by train, and it was interesting to see the differences. And they're all better systems than the British trains, I have to say.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. Well, I think that's probably not saying too much. And they are getting more modernised.
Yeah,
so no disrespect to the British railway system.
No.
And then, can you speak Japanese?
I can speak some Japanese, kind of enough to get on trains and buy tickets and talk about the weather and.
Okay.
I can't really read Japanese, and actually I've been trying recently just to sort of try and get up my Chinese characters. And Japanese got 3 systems for writing. There's a kind of an alphabet equivalent called hiragana, and then the same again but for foreign words called katakana, and then there are all the Chinese symbols as well. So it's quite a feat to sort of know enough to be able to read a newspaper, for example.
Right.
Kind of 12 years in the education system, Japanese kids learn enough to be able to sort of read the newspaper.
Yeah.
So it's quite a commitment, but I've been trying to a little bit more get my reading better, because I think that was the thing we found this time. It's harder to eat, like going to restaurants and things, because you actually can't tell from outside what kind of a restaurant it is.
Oh, really?
Because you can't read anything.
Yes, yes. So you're going purely by a visual.
Visual thing. So that's what I've been doing recently. But I can speak enough to get by. And when we were staying with my friends in this place in Aizu, Nishi Aizu it's called, because one of them, the husband is the mayor of the town, we had to go and do official greetings with the mayor. So even though we were sort of staying with him and kind of on the Monday morning we had breakfast with him and then he went off to work, we then had a sort of official greetings where we were taken to the town hall and met him officially.
How lovely, though.
And
I suppose that must have been very new for your husband to go
so
through.
So he was a bit sort of bemused, I think. and because it's a very small town, it has its own little cable television station, and so the mayor just sort of told his assistant that they should get the cable TV in. So 5 minutes later, because they're literally sort of in the next door building, a reporter with a camera came and then started asking me questions in Japanese about, what I remembered about my time there. So I suddenly found myself having to summon enough Japanese to answer
lots of these questions. Oh, good for you.
And that's when I realised that, I can get by with sort of very simple stuff, but anything complex is a bit of a challenge. And then the next day, this little news item with me meeting the mayor was on the local.
Oh, lovely.
Cable
well, I suppose
TV
it's
station,
a big thing that somebody who was there so many years ago has actually come back to see, especially with all that the area has had to cope with.
Yeah.
And has it changed a lot as a result of?
So that, it's quite far away from where the sort of main impacts were. So I think it wasn't obvious to me that area had changed. I think actually, strangely, what had happened was more people had moved in to that particular area. So it suffers, as a lot of rural Japan does, from depopulation. And I think after, because families obviously couldn't live on the coast anymore.
Yes.
They did actually, some people moved back into the area with their families. But it wasn't obvious.
So it's a nuclear fallout, isn't it? For how long can they not go back? Is it? How many decades does it take to recover?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. One of the sad things that, because now Fukushima is associated with that kind of nuclear hazard. The area where I lived is very much, it's a rice farming area. And so there's this kind of, Japanese are not that keen to eat products from Fukushima because of that association, even though this region is actually quite a long way away from that area. So
yes. Okay.
Challenging.
Yeah, no, definitely. So actually that nicely kind of ties in with your environmental interests, shall we say, with the work that you do with it's the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. And you're a senior
program manager. Yeah.
Program manager.
Yeah.
How did you get into that role of environmental issues? Is it
completely accidentally?
Yeah. Maybe first I should say, I have to admit not knowing much about the foundation and who Calouste Gulbenkian was, but he was Armenian originally.
He was an Armenian born in the sort of 1870s in Turkey, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. He was from a wealthy merchant family, but he was a brilliant engineer, and he did a sort of walking tour of what then became sort of the Middle East, and I just understood what role, this kind of turn of the 20th century, what role oil was going to play.
Yes.
And he kind of negotiated all the oil rights between the Ottoman Empire and then all the, the UK and the US and Holland and Russia. And he was called Mr. 5% because he originally got 5% of all the sort of oil rights of carving up the Middle East.
Oh,
oil.
really?
So that's where he made his money, and he was like the kind of when he died, he was one of the sort of richest men in the world. He died in the 1950s, and he'd been educated in London, went to King's, and then he lived most of his life in Paris. But then during the Second World War, because of the fall of the occupation of France, he decided he was going to go to America, and at the time the only way you could do that was via Lisbon, which was neutral, supposedly. So he got to Lisbon, and he basically stayed.
He loved it so much.
Just loved it.
Well, Lisbon's beautiful. I don't blame him, actually.
Then they made it very comfortable for him. And he lived the last 15 years of his life in Lisbon, and when he died, he left most of his fortune to setting up a foundation, which then became based in Portugal, in Lisbon, but has always had a London office and a Paris office, kind of reflecting his own history.
Yes.
So it's a big foundation. If you're ever in Lisbon, it's really worth going to. It's got lovely gardens, and there's a concert hall there, a modern art gallery. There's a gallery a museum that's based on his collection. He was a great collector.
Yes.
It's got beautiful things in it. There's a science institute. So it's a really, really big institution in Portugal. It's sort of everyone's knows about the Gulbenkian Foundation there.
Yes.
And then it also has some grant funding programs, and that's principally what the UK office does. It has 3 grant funding programs. One of those in the arts, which is all around the civic role of arts. So it's about encouraging arts organisations to to really take on a civic role in their communities.
Yes.
And then there are 2 sort of environment grant funding programs. So there's the ocean work called Valuing the Ocean, which I've been managing for the last few years.
Yes.
And then we're just beginning a new climate program, which is sort of in its very early stages, but they're both really focused on how you communicate more effectively, why these things matter, and what can be done. So,
and very topical for the moment.
Yes, very much so.
And how? So the ocean one, you're specifically looking at the waters, the sea, the oceans around the UK, or is it globally as well, and how our impacts?
Yes, it's both. It began in 2013, and we sort of did what we call a scoping study, looking at what were the challenges, what needed to happen, what were the issues, where our resources could be best used.
Yes.
And what that research showed was that there, things like climate change and overfishing and pollution were kind of key issues, but sort of underneath it all was problem that people really didn't understand why the ocean mattered.
Really, as simple as that.
Yeah. So really communicating what the ocean does and why it's important that it's healthy and functioning.
Yes.
More effectively was a kind of key underpinning piece, and also that people the vast amounts of the ocean is kind of unknown. But a lot is known, but the sort of knowledge is very siloed, so people weren't necessarily working very effectively across disciplines in order to sort of make the most of. So we focused the work actually, rather than on a particular issue, on these 2 kind of underlying approaches, which was about communicating more effectively and collaborating more effectively.
Yeah. So how, as an individual, looking at how could I help, or what do I need to understand more to then initiate the way I do things or the way I live?
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting, because what a lot of the kind of communications research shows is that it is about individual behaviour change, and that's going to be a big part of what needs to happen. But actually it's about, in order to kind of motivate people and make people feel that they have a role to play and that they can be effective, they need to understand how the system needs to change.
Yes.
So it's about what government needs to do, it's about what business needs to do. And so helping people understand what the connections, or what needs to happen, but also then who needs to really be doing that in order for the system to evolve is a key part of it. So one of the projects that I'm just thinking about London that we have supported, we set up this collaboration of organisations working together that all brought different skills. So some of them were marine conservation organisations, but some of them had expertise in the law or in economics or communications. and different initiatives have come out of this collaboration. And one of them is called One Less. It's the One Less bottle campaign.
Okay.
And it's focused on London, and it looks at London. What it did was, and this was just before the sort of big explosion of interest and focus on plastic pollution. It looks at London as a system and asks the question, what would need to happen in London, what would need to change in London for London to go single-use plastic water bottle free?
Yes.
And so it kind of mapped the system and tried to understand it, and then looked at all the things that needed to change. So that's kind of the policy changes, it's individual behaviour, it's business behaviour, and also really trying to connect people in a place like London, obviously a big urban environment,
Yes.
to a sense of their connection to the sea.
Okay.
So all the communications and messaging have been about London on sea.
Oh, really?
Interesting.
Interesting.
They've got a brilliant logo, which is like a whale which is holding up the London Eye and the sort of the gherkin and things. So it's showing how the sea is underpinning, kind of London.
Yes.
And rather than sort of trying to influence people by talking about plastic pollution and waste, they've very much talked about that sort of connection to the sea, to see if that can motivate people, and they've found that it does. So as a result of this, it began in 2016, and the idea was to influence the then mayoral elections. And initially Sadiq Khan, when he was a candidate, was not interested at all. But they really worked well, and they managed to influence all of the sort of policy around plastic bottles and pollution in London, so that the mayor committed £5 million to setting up water fountains. And actually, if you go to places around London, you'll see One Less water fountains. There's one outside the Tate Modern.
Yes.
And
because the We Are Waterloo business improvement group,
yeah.
they also had a big strategy towards it.
They set up a peer network,
Interesting.
One Less peer network, so lots of businesses and places like Borough Market, and then institutions like Natural History Museum and business improvement districts have all become part of this peer pioneer network, looking at not only how they can reduce use of single-use plastic water bottles, but sort of single-use plastic across their sort of supply chains. And so it's had this big kind of snowball effect.
That's interesting.
But really trying to look at the whole thing as a system and how you can influence the system. So one thing that people can do is the mayoral elections are coming up again in May.
Yes.
And so one of the things they're trying to do is influence the candidates to take on some of the recommendations to kind of maintain the policies
momentum,
and the momentum.
Yes.
So you can be asking candidates what their views and policies are on issue of single-use plastic pollution, but also other environmental issues.
Of course, yes.
And in fact, there's going to be a green hustings online on the 12th of April, I think.
We'll put the links in the show notes so people can check that out if they get people engaged. Because I mean, we all think we're trying to do our bit, but the bigger issue is businesses should be doing more and governments should be doing more. But I think it's good to know that as individuals we can also do more, and that it does matter. Because sometimes you can get so overwhelmed that what does it matter if I buy plastic bottles of water, because the businesses and the governments aren't actually doing their bit. But by understanding that actually it does matter and it does make a difference, then we should all be engaged more. I mean, I think how does the foundation see sort of the roles of Greta Thunberg, for example? Is she having an impact on how you also engage, or you're using her as a model also?
Yeah, I think she's really interesting. So in Lisbon they set up a €1 million prize for action on climate change, and the first one was last year, and Greta Thunberg won it.
Okay.
And so that money is going to kind of foundations that she's involved in. But actually, personally, I think, and from the sort of communications research, I think there's quite an interesting issue around that, because the research shows really clearly that if you just go on about the crisis, it's really demotivating.
Yeah, because you're overwhelmed with everything that's wrong. That what can we do to help?
Yeah, and people feel powerless, like it's too late as well. And so, actually, we need to be. It needs to be very solutions focused. It needs to be. People need to kind of realise the things that are all the kind of amazing stuff that is already happening, because there is amazing stuff happening, and it needs to be just couched much more in that sort of kind of positive, we can do this, and actually these are the things that are already happening. So looking at something like One Less, the Business Pioneer Network, and not just individual organisations, but through their own supply chains, they're having amazing impact. One of the organisations that are part of it are the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I think just through a connection that someone had.
Yes.
And now all the sort of embassies around the world, British embassies, are looking at their plastic in their supply chain and what they can do.
So that's good, yes.
So
and it's a knock-on effect. If one does it, then they go, well, why are you doing that? And then another one will try, and you have the Mexican wave effect almost. Yes.
So
it must be very challenging, but also step by step rewarding.
It's real, and the organisations and the people that are involved, that are really doing, the NGOs that are sort of doing the work and coming up with the campaigns, just amazing people. So it feels a real privilege to be able to do a little bit, which is like enable relatively small amounts of funding to go towards these organisations and issues. And it is really urgent. And I mean, the ocean is fundamental to the way the climate works. So that's one of the things that we're really focused on at the moment, is trying to kind of communicate the idea that the ocean and climate are part of one integrated system. And so in order to tackle climate change, you need a healthy ocean.
Yes.
And so you need solutions that are good for climate and the ocean, because actually it's part of the same thing. So really being able to take a holistic view is going to be critical.
Yes. It's like everything. If you just focus on one thing, you lose sight of the whole picture, and you need everything in balance to work together to make it, to have a proper sustainable end result.
Absolutely.
Very easy to say when we just much harder to do in practice. But it's good to hear that there's progress, and lots of people out there wanting to push this agenda forward, and have the money to be able to support projects like this. So.
And it's a big year as well. We've got, obviously, the UK is hosting the climate conference at the end of the year in November.
Yeah.
We're also hosting the G7 summit in July. So lots of the environmental organisations are kind of going to use those opportunities to say, in the UK, we want to be a leader in this, and so we need to be doing these things at home in order to show that leadership to the world.
So there'll be a spotlight, and it's an opportunity as well to influence a lot of the good things. Okay. So also, you're not from an environmental background. You're from a very literally literature background. So, on that note, what kind of literature is it that you love to read? And
I love good stories. I love novels. I love poetry. When I was younger, I loved all the big Victorian novels. Sort of Middlemarch and Tolstoy, War and Peace. And then it seemed like you had the time to read those then. I think recently, so I love really sort of brilliantly written stories, but also that somehow kind of give you insight into people's lives and the way you need to live or not need, but you kind of just thinking about kind of how you should live your life. And things that I've read recently that I've loved. So I read Toni Morrison's Beloved,
Yes, yes.
Which I never read at the time when it came out, but I just read it last year and it just blew me away. I thought it was just amazing.
I still haven't read it. It was one very popular book actually in the bookshop, and it became popular because one customer came in saying, "Have you got a copy of Beloved?" And I did, and it drew my attention to it as well. And it seemed because that one customer came, I then had a whole stream of people coming and buying that book, and I don't know why, whether also Toni Morrison, there was a spotlight on her and her writings. She died quite recently as well, so maybe because of that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So that's one book that has.
So that was one book, and I love people like Haruki Murakami. Just trying to think of other.
Have ones related to your environmental kind of interests? Is there something along that line? I remember that you coming in and buying Robert Macfarlane's.
That's right, Robert Macfarlane. His Lost Words is absolutely just stunning, and it's done amazing things. They managed to raise funding to give it to lots of schools across the UK.
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's really sort of created a whole movement around it.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting, the relationship between language and the environment. How language holds knowledge about the environment. I remember, not something we ever funded, but in the Amazon there's an organisation that was devoted to preserving the kind of local Amazon languages, because actually the knowledge of the Amazon jungle was held in the languages.
Interesting.
So, and actually that's one of the things I love about London, is the way the layers of history are held in the street names. And
definitely, yes.
You've got near where I live in Kennington, there's Black Prince Road, and that's because the Black Prince Palace was there in 13 something or other. So that sense of the layers of history held by the language and the names.
Yes. They hint at it now, and you have to go and look it up, because even though it may be lost visually, it's still there in written form somewhere, isn't it? Quite often. So. Well, I suppose not in the Amazon, not in the jungle.
No.
It's all very much word of mouth, but it's also through stories, isn't it? And if you don't understand the language, you won't understand the stories that have come down.
Yeah, no. Just thinking who else So there's a writer who's a poet, but also a short story writer, David Constantine. He's a brilliant poet and short story writer.
Okay.
And I think one of the things I like is where literature somehow, magic realism is a kind of too strong, but somehow it walks the line between kind of everyday life and something that's beyond everyday life. And there's a kind of magical possibility that's sort of just beyond something that you can touch, and literature somehow kind of captures that.
Yes.
Which I really like. And I guess Haruki Murakami does that quite a bit.
Yes. We read one of his books, didn't we, for our travelling through book club as well.
Yeah.
One about the sheep. I've forgotten what it was.
The wild sheep chase.
That's right, the wild sheep. And actually that was the first Murakami book that I read, and actually I really enjoyed it. It is very different to anything else I had read before. So, but obviously that's your connection to Japan too, isn't it?
Yeah.
So are there certain books that have influenced you to travel to certain places as a result of reading them?
It's a really good
Or does
question.
it go round, or is it the other way round? Are you sort of drawn towards a place, and then through reading you say, right, I do want to go there?
Yeah, I think it's more like that. I sort of ended up going to Japan slightly, again, accidentally. When I was in my last year, I studied English at university, and I just didn't know what I was going to do with it, as you don't. And there was an advert one day for this, it's called the JET program, Japanese Exchange and Teaching Program. And you could apply and go to Japan for a year and teach English, and so that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah.
But having been there, I then read lots of Japanese literature. So I think it's more sort of I go somewhere and then look for the literature that helps you sort of understand the culture more.
Yes, yeah. Your travels went from Japan, you went on to New Zealand, and was it to Singapore you went?
Yeah, so we went to New Zealand and then Australia and then the Philippines. Got family in New Zealand, so that was lovely just to sort of catch up with people, and it's a beautiful country.
And when you go to places now, do you go to places with your environmental eyes wide open, or do you switch off when you're travelling?
So on this trip, I sort of had a 3-month sabbatical trip, and part of the kind of the argument for going was to have slightly to do some sort of work-related things. So we went to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and
beautiful,
got to see
yeah.
sort of what's left, which
Yes.
was amazing. And then went to the Philippines to specifically catch up with some work that the Zoological Society of London have been doing in the Philippines with local communities. Again, they've created this amazing sort of circular economy project originally around plastic fishing nets. So the local fishermen collect them, and then they sort of develop this very simple technology for baling them up, and then they've developed this relationship with a global carpet tile manufacturer.
Oh, wow.
So the fishing nets get sold to this global company, and then the money goes back into the local community and has enabled all sorts of other things to happen in these
That's fascinating.
really, really poor communities.
Yes, yes.
And then they've sort of now extended the model to seaweed farming, so they're developing new kind of more sustainable type seaweed farming in these areas.
I saw this happening when we 2019 now, when we were walking the Portuguese Camino, that they were raking up the seaweed. I don't know whether that's come from there, or is it
I think it just globally there's much more recognition of what a sustainable and useful product seaweed is.
Yes.
And in the Philippines, people are, because the areas have been so overfished and it's so impacted by climate change that, you know, communities that completely relied on fishing, you know, they can fish all day and get no fish at all.
Really?
And,
Wow.
you know, people are really very, very challenged. And so London Zoo have been working with these communities that they now, you know, they've been working there a long time and they know them well, to establish these seaweed farms in order to kind of diversify their incomes and produce something that, you know, that they can live from. Yeah, so we actually got to spend a couple of days with the team in the Philippine team.
Yes.
And visited, they took us out on these tiny little boats and showed us the seaweed, kind of they're slightly offshore, these seaweed farms.
Where was it actually up the coast then? Where were you in the Philippines?
So we were on an island called Bohol, which is like sort of in the central.
Because there's about 100 islands, isn't there? Because I forget the name of the place. I'm sure it began with B. So it was the King's Summer Palace area, and then you could take little boats out to all these islands, and they said, which island would you like to go to? Oh, I don't know. But he took us to one that was just completely isolated. There was no one else there but us, and it was incredible.
Yeah, it's a stunning place.
Yeah. But here, this is one of the islands where they do
this is one of the islands, yeah. Yeah, so we spent 2 days sort of, we stayed in this tiny little hut on this tiny little island, and took these little boats out and visited the seaweed farms and the local communities and saw sort of how they were collecting the fishing nets and recycling them. It was kind of fascinating, very humbling as well.
Yes,
you know. Yeah. And the way London Zoo originally got involved in this region was about 20 years ago, they set up a marine protected area for these little seahorses. Mm-hmm. So they took us night watch. You have to go at night snorkeling to look at these seahorses.
Oh, amazing!
So we were like just off this little island in the middle of the sea, going snorkeling at night. It was pretty terrifying, actually.
Was it?
But I'm not the strongest swimmer, so And it was actually very shallow, so I don't think anything too, but you can't stand because of all the coral that you don't want to stand on and
of course,
destroy. And we had two guides who were kind of swimming off and showing us these tiny little seahorses.
Do they glow in the dark then? Or is
No,
it just
because so they had, poor old seahorses, they had torches,
yes.
so they could show us. But actually the most amazing bit for me was like when I could relax and just lie on your back and you're like in the dark sea and the amazing stars, just
really?
A whole canopy of stars.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, it was really special.
It's little moments like that which it's the camera in your mind that is greater than any physical camera taking photographs, because it stays with you forever, doesn't it?
So and then we went to our final place was Singapore, but by that time coronavirus had caught up with us.
Oh, had it really?
So we were going to stay with some friends, and they couldn't meet us because we'd had to sort of go via Hong Kong at one point, and because we'd been in China, our friends couldn't in Singapore. The rules by that stage, this was right at the beginning of February last year. The rules in Singapore were such that they couldn't meet us because they would have had to have gone into quarantine.
Right.
And we could sort of, it was really clear, having been in the Philippines, and coronavirus was going to be a really serious thing.
Was it? Yeah.
So we decided...
Clear in what way?
Because in the Philippines, over the 2 weeks that we were in the Philippines, by the sort of beginning of the second week, you couldn't register at hotels unless you'd had your temperature checked.
Oh gosh, right.
Yeah,
so they were well ahead of us with all
absolutely,
those kind of restrictions and putting...
and Singapore's very sort of regulated place anyway, and they were very anxious about it. And we decided to cut our trip short by just a few days, and really we just sort of could see that you could end up getting caught, not being able to get home because of it. So we got back in early February.
So literally it was just a few days short of your 3 months away. So you were very lucky. Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't realise it was that tight. So of course, I mean, obviously in Asian countries as well, they've been hit by SARS and other serious viruses spreading across their countries. So they're more aware of how quickly these things can get out of hand. So here we are back in London, or here you are back in London, but working from home.
Yeah.
And has that impacted you? How? Physically and mentally, or has it been a case that you've just, because you're right in the centre of London anyway, I mean, what have the challenges been for you?
So in lots of ways, it's just been really, really lucky. Because we've got enough space at home, we've got a little garden, and actually it's quite nice not having to commute. But after a while, and we're a small team at the Gulbenkian in London, and we have daily catch-ups first thing. But after a while you do begin to miss just that sort of the casual exchange that you have in an office with your colleagues. I think it will be nice when we do go back to the office, not to go back all the time, but at least like 1 or 2 days a week.
A lot of people have got very settled in having days working from home and realised how nice that is.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Not having the commute and using those hours more effectively or efficiently, shall we say.
Yeah. So certainly being as busy, if not busier, and working longer hours, and it's quiet and you can focus, on apart from all the Zoom calls. You can sort of spend hours and hours.
You can get very distracted by looking at screen time. I mean, that's, I think, probably the hardest thing for people is, for some people, screen time is just part of daily life and was before, but for others it's been much harder to have to spend so much time looking at screens and how that's going to affect our eyesight as well going forward.
I know. Yeah, because normally we'd have meetings and then you wouldn't be looking at a screen, but now everything is via the screen.
Yes. So when things hopefully get back to normal, where Where in London would you like to, where in London have you missed going to in this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of the other, like parks and places like Kew Gardens I love,
Yes.
that I haven't been to much. And also just wandering around the shops, doing a bit of window shopping and, just a sense of, and the theatre. Really interesting, I've been reading a book that's sort of collection of people's diary entries across a year in London, across the centuries. And the number of times people, whether it's the 17th century or the 20th century, talk about going to the theatre, and you realise that the theatre is sort of fundamental to the DNA of London.
Definitely, yes. Yeah. And I mean, it's because there are so many theatres in London and so many shows going on. Can you the impact it's had on so many people as well? I know they've tried to put things online, but it's not quite the same, is it? So, and your heart goes out to those who are really suffering because they can't all be online, can they? So the sooner theatres can get back to, and the arts generally get back to normal, would be a good thing for them, significantly so, and for us, for our mental health as well. Going abroad, if everything opened up tomorrow, have you somewhere that you want to go first?
Yes, I think there are two places. So one is, my husband lived in Greece for a few years, in Athens. So I think we just love to, I think we're missing Europe. We'd love to just go to Greece and, just be quiet somewhere beautiful and warm. So that's one. I normally, because obviously the foundation's Portuguese, I'm normally going to Lisbon a few times a year.
Yes.
So it'd be lovely to be able to go back.
Do you like the pastel de natas?
I love pastel de natas.
They're not the same here, are they? You have to get a proper Portuguese one to really appreciate them.
Yeah, fantastic coffee and wine, and actually all the cakes in Lisbon. And then I think, depending on what happens next year, thinking about going back to Japan.
Okay.
Maybe for 2 or 3 months, just to spend a bit more time there.
Yes. Your love affair with Japan continues.
We'll see.
Yes.
And then there are whole parts of the world that I've never been to, like South America and things. So maybe one day.
Yes. It's a big world out there, isn't there? We can't see it all in our lifetime, however much we would like to. So here we sit. It's a bit windy and cold, isn't it, for us for a spring day? Apparently next week it's going to be 22 degrees, which it seems ridiculous. We're sitting here shivering a bit, but it's beautiful being in the Chelsea Physic Garden. So if people listening haven't been, do come. It's a beautiful space. It's quite a small space, but it's beautifully laid out, and I expect as spring really springs forth, it will be lovely. But it's nice coming at this time of year with the hellebores and stuff. So. But on a final environmental note, Louisa, if you could offer one piece of advice to me and to the listeners about what they could start doing, or even a question that we should be asking ourselves to help the environment, what would it be?
So one of the things about lockdown is people have really appreciated more or recognised more their sense of connection to the natural world, and I think let's really build on that and do things that can help us realise the benefits. And so whether it's nurturing your basil pot in your on your windowsill, or whether it's volunteering to do cleaning up the foreshore of the Thames, sort of doing beach cleans, or whether it's doing your bit of recycling, just kind of doing it with that sense of kind of love and benefit, and how you're connected to both the natural world and to everyone else. It feels that's kind of message of connection is a real lesson that we've learnt from the last year, and let's build on that.
Yes. Good piece of advice, I think. And I think now that spring's coming, people are planting seeds, and that's a great way, just to having a couple of pots on your window ledge, that everybody can do that, or even have them inside or outside. It's just the little things, isn't it? You feel that you are doing something. Well, thank you very much, Louisa. It's been so lovely talking to you and just learning a little bit more about your life too, which when people came into the shop, you just get snippets, but you never really knew what you really were about. And yeah, I definitely remember you coming into the shop, and it was very much you would come and you'd scan the bookshelves, particularly at Christmas time, for books that you were going to come back and buy. So that was always lovely. I always used to see you on Christmas Eve, I think it was, for the 5 years that we were there.
Yeah.
So
very much.
So hopefully we'll see you at the next book club if I hopefully make it, because I think they've just chosen a book which is about British food.
That's
yes,
right,
so I will be putting that up on the Travelling Through website too. But to all our podcast listeners out there, I hope you've enjoyed the show. Hope you've enjoyed listening to our little chat here, and you've been inspired. I certainly have. If you've enjoyed it, please share with your friends. Please leave us a review and a rating, that would be really helpful, and subscribe if you can. But for now, enjoy your weekend, your week coming up. Take care, and thanks for listening.